Hi everyone, thank you for coming to this paper on the borderlands knowledge. Um, Today I'm going to explore a series of multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary seminars that occurred at the University of East Anglia and the School of Environmental Sciences through Geographies of Knowledge and Co-Production. And I do this to understand them as key sites of knowledge and future making, particularly related to the environmental sciences. The Zuckerman seminars are more like conferences as they're a weekend long and jam-packed full of presentations and discussions. As I mentioned, they took place at UEA during the 1970s and are thought to be the brainchild of Solly Zuckerman, who had previously proposed the idea of the School of Environmental Sciences whilst operating as a science advisor to government. And so this paper draws from a PhD work that explores the history and geography of the environmental sciences at UEA as a kind of specific yet relational space of knowledge making. My exploration into the Zuckerman seminars, albeit were a bit derailed by COVID, and lack of re-access to archives and such. They're a small part, but quite an important part, as I will go on to show. And I hope to reveal how the seminars themselves were a stellar case in showing how knowledge crossed borders to encourage interaction between seemingly separate arenas of politics, business, and the university. And in doing so, they carved out desirable environmental futures that started from Zuckerman, predominantly ones that were techno-scientific and technocratic and associated with planning and management. And they're novel in the sense that they brought together this unique and important cast of actors together in the same space, and I think for the first time in the UK. The extent to which new knowledge was made together is discussed later on, but the seminars themselves were crucial aspects of shaping END's reputation as a site of environmental sciences, knowledge making, use, and circulation. And so between 1970 and 1980, there were a range of seminars that were put on, as I've listed here, with the first one, which was Challenges of Environmental Change. And then after this, there was 5 others: Control of Environmental Change and Pollution, Environmental Standards, Social and Political Consequences of Cars, Management of Water Resources, Regional Policy and Planning, and Environmental Impact Assessments. And so for this paper, I've been guided by Craggs and Marnie, our very own Martin Marnie here today. Their paper from 2014, which explored the conference as an important site of geographical inquiry, thinking through different concepts of visibility, performance in space, knowledge production, and protest. And the conference can be understood as sites that transform wider material geographies, public performances of legitimacy in knowledge, and important tools of consensus or dissensus building. And so these are just a few of the whole suite of functions that the conference can offer. Importantly, though, conference proceedings and conference space mutually exert multiple functions, both intentionally and passively, that shape what happens at the event and in turn reshapes the context in which it emerges, and can have radical effects on the future of the context in which it emerges and the future things it orients around. And so, for instance, also how the conference supports the performance of knowledge, which then also supports or constrains particular framings of knowledge and ideas across particular scales, like the annual RGS conference that we're at today, which its theme centres on borders and bordering, or our own session on the historical geographies of environmental futures. We've all channeled and shaped the ways in which we organise and present our research in line with the call for papers that we sent out. And as you can see on the right is a photo I taken in 2018 at an in-person conference on science communication. And now it's just interesting with COVID how the physical site has become virtual and how, this may alter Craggs and Marnie's paper or thoughts. And so, most importantly for my own work, I view the conference as both, the theoretical idea or the rational idea of the conference and as a physical space. I view them as sites of co-production. Drawing from the co-productionist idiom from Sheila Jasanoff, in which the mutual construction of the normative and the epistemic, or put simply, the ways in which we know the world are inseparable from the ways in which we have chosen to live it. Whilst Craggs and Marnie make implicit connection to these ideas, I build on them more emphatically, or I try to at least, to explore the co-production of environmental knowledge and social order vis-a-vis the construction and foregrounding of imaginable environmental futures, both challenges, knowledge gaps, through the Zuckerman seminars, the guiding aims and the ideas, and the material and institutional arrangements in which they are embedded. And specifically, I think through how particular visions of the environmental futures emerge, gain traction or legitimacy through Zuckerman and the Zuckerman seminars. And also importantly, Paul Ward's and others' intellectual history, the recent one in 2018, they note that conferences in the post-war period concerning man and nature marked the beginning of a future that, contained the environmental sciences, contained environmental challenges, and contained possible strategies or management plans to alleviate this. And so for them, the conferences contained multiple experts from various natural science disciplines with various natural scientific viewpoints. And through this, an amalgamation of expertise kind of, was formed, and then this was reframed into new environmental expertise. And it's probably worth noting that Zuckerman, throughout his career, was keen in assessing the current state of science, or particularly challenging science, and then discussing this with relevant experts, or who he deemed as experts, and then proposed possible courses of action, usually programs of research or bodies or organisations that could put this into practice. Zuckerman believed in the social uses of science, but more as a linear input of science into policy and society. So I rambled on a little bit there, but kicking things off, Zuckerman had now retired from his formal government duties to his holiday home in Norfolk and became more involved in the happenings of ENV. And so he decided to request funds from UEA to host the Challenge of Environmental Change. This was to be a seminar or one of the first seminars that informed and reviewed several aspects of the unfolding scene, including population changes, prospects for economic growth, provision of food and water, the treatment of waste, the possible impact of long-term climatic changes on development programs, environmental amenities, etc. And so importantly, there was a whole range of wide breadth of concerns that Zuckerman, mentioned here to Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister at the time. And he writes this to Harold Wilson because he believes that they cross-cut many areas of government interest, and so was requesting the invite of a number of ministers. And so Harold Wilson replied and noted the importance of the seminar, but decided to not go himself and send the Minister for Local Government and Planning instead, who would be more relevant and receptive to the topics that Zuckerman had written about. So the seminar included a whole array of multidisciplinary, multi-perspective, various expertise in their presentations, including economic growth from the OECD, water and food presentations from directors of both the Water Resources Board and Water Pollution Labs. The Director of Economics and Statistics from the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food also gave a presentation. And there was also presentations from conservation, changing land use, with people associated with Nature Conservancy. And then there was a number of academics from UEA filling in gaps on social political issues, with Lord Kennet rounding up the weekend by assessing what the importance of this was, and the promise it may have for government futures and action. And so also Hubert Lamb, while at the Met Office at the time, came and talked about climate change. And so it was deemed a great success by all involved, with high praise coming from students and junior academics through to ministers and directors. And most notably, it was this aspect of, cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary conversation, and the fact that the seminar was an intentional space to encourage this between seemingly and previously thought to be disparate worlds. And this is something that Zuckerman was really keen on doing when he proposed the school, having been involved in shaping UK science policy since World War II, and explicitly created this space for this to materialise. And so with this in mind, he then applied for more substantial funding from the Ford Foundation, as he wanted this to be of international scope and importance. And apparently there was little suitable funding that could support this endeavour in the UK. And so through the Ford Foundation and securing publishing contracts, the proceedings of the conference could circulate from ENV internationally. But as you can see here, the importance of the series of the seminars was to more directly and intentionally bring a further diverse form of expertise and relevant actors together to share knowledge, illuminate emerging present and future concerns, and carve out future plans, whether these were strategies, research programs, or even to some extent policy. And due to the rapid pace in which the field was developing and to which new environmental challenges were constantly being made known, it was important to get this underway. And so, as noted earlier, the seminar topics were officially these that I've listed here, and these are the ones that the Ford Foundation funded. I won't go into the depth of the content of these because obviously I mentioned I didn't have access to the specific archives that these were in. But as you can see, the topics of interest were really broad, but also quite narrow. You see, from international control all the way through to, regionally specific England and Wales management of water resources. But how these kind of topics came about were through conversations between Zuckerman and Keith Clayton, who was Dean of the ENV at the time. And between these two, they thought these were the key issues needing commentary and analysis for business and political worlds. And so Zuckerman also had a major say in who was invited to present talks. And he also pre-circulated sometimes discussion topics, which I'll talk about in the next slide. But importantly, these seminars were an embodiment of Zuckerman's network and authority as an expert, particularly in the realms of science policy. So to be invited to these seminars was a privilege, and participants were not to spend a thing. All food and accommodation was paid for, and lunches and dinners were encouraged to carry conversation on in an informal way. And there was junior academics there in the same room with leaders of industry, civic society, ministers, directors. It's hard to imagine something like this happening today. But also the arrangements and the inclusions of these forms of expertise meant that particular ways of imagining and knowing environment futures were enacted and brought into life. One that renders, environmental challenges as cross-disciplinary and multispatial. And this was guided by Zuckerman. This wasn't something that was collective or inclusive. This was purely guided by Zuckerman and to some extent Clayton. And so how did they operate? So there was no media presence or coverage despite the books. That was the only kind of output that came from these. And this was really important for Zuckerman because he wanted ministers, directors and academics to all have frank, confidential discussions and not say things that may be skewed in the public eye. And so the actual seminars themselves were predominantly chaired by Zuckerman, who, as I said, organised the discussions and circulated often topics, which sometimes included things like why are environmental standards needing to be set, or should standards themselves be standardised, or should they vary nationally, or what are the priorities or competing interests of business, university and government. And so the seminars acted a bit like a round table, not as much as a conference, as I mentioned at the beginning. They weren't Q&As after the presentations. The speaker went up, spoke about whatever topic they were speaking. The paper had already been pre-circulated as well, so the audience kind of had an idea of what was coming, could, think about what the key points of discussion would be. And so Zuckerman also, in the published proceedings, either wrote the foreword or the epilogues. And this was a key selling point for the Ford Foundation. And so now, starting to think about the importance of the seminars. Returning to the ideas of Craigs and Marnie, the Zuckerman seminars were indeed key spaces of knowledge production and the performance of authority, following the direction carved out by Zuckerman, in which researchers in ENV, mostly ENV, but to some extent others at UEA, and also directors and ministers, could all reveal to each other the new knowledge that was being made, new understandings of the problems, new perspectives of the problems, and new ways of thinking about how we might solve or alleviate the new environmental problems. And so, as a result, they were becoming the new experts for the new challenges of the environment. And also, due to the repetition of the seminars, almost always on a yearly basis, and the publications that came out of this, ENV began to be known as a site of environmental science and research, and as a medium that connected knowledge and researchers. as one now retired professor involved notes when I spoke to him about a year ago here. And by the fact that M got into the groove, by the groove he means as a key player in the geographies of environmental knowledge. And so they also acted as a performance of inter or multidisciplinarity, showcasing M's capacity to host and facilitate interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, multi-perspective, diverse perspective framings of work, underscoring that framing that the environmental challenges cross-cut many areas and many matters of concern and need to be addressed as such. And so I've briefly touched on this already, but of course the seminars revealed the impermeable boundaries between previously thought to be distant arenas, business, government and university. And Zuckerman was well aware of this, obviously, when he proposed the idea. And so he knew about the differences between the goals, values, ideas, guiding aims, knowledges of these three. And, the seminars were a way to connect and align both the epistemic and normative commitments of these groups. Yet, despite being one of the first to join these different arenas, knowledge co-production or co-construction in the sense of doing things together was not really achieved in the ways that it is set out for today, through institutions like ICBES. And so as you can see in my crude figures here, on the right we see three distant circles, but with arrows that go back and forth to signal interactions between the three, all embedded within another circle of environmental challenges, rather than the one on the left, which is obviously not what happened in a kind of cohesive integration of new knowledge. But also, what was really novel was the fact that these three arenas were interacting together. They were talking about these challenges that were new in, the UK. They were, I hesitantly said new ways of looking at these challenges or new ways of organising these challenges, and new areas of concern. This wasn't a novel thing, and it really did help cement the environment as a multi-faceted area of concern. The sharing of different forms of expertise beyond the academy was an important thing that these seminars brought about. Again, in the last slide, I mentioned about the performance of interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinary. John Agar, in a recent chapter, looks at the emergence of the new universities of the 1960s, in which UEA was one. And these came about to reinvigorate a stagnant and cemented disciplinary-focused higher education. And so, this was really a performance of that as well. And to, really show what the shift in higher education policy and, construction of the university was about. And so ultimately, the seminars were key spaces of future making through imagining what the environment and its challenges may be, the effects of this, how to manage, plan against, and or solve. And these were predominantly techno-scientific or technocratic, with the view that science can shed light and solve and protect against a plethora of environmental problems in society, both at the time and possible ones in the future. And so the experts were supposed to realign their knowledge to the new environmental challenge and help support environmental planning and management through interaction with government ministers. That's what Zuckerman thought. And a seemingly simple problem can be solved through the expert and logical mind of the scientist. But we also must remember at the time there was an environmental movement gaining traction from Richard Carlson and toxicology concerns in Silent Spring, and this kind of unified environments into the environment. There was the Stockholm Conference, and then obviously limits to growth, which forecasted major population and resource issues for the future. But for Zuckerman, these were issues that were based in planning and management. Bad planning and bad management of resources would lead to this. And so, like the problem of war, scientific expertise could be applied to solve this problem. But, this time in continual conversation with those in business and government. And so ENV acted as a space of performance of authority through new environmental scientific knowledge. The seminars dedicated to challenges also legitimised the concern through the materialities of the conference and the published proceedings, and in turn, to some extent, shaped how things were known how things were possible to be known, and the power to include or exclude some areas of concern that may have occurred. I'm cautious of time here. So to sum up, I think the Zuckerman seminars were a key moment in the history of the UEA and UK environmental sciences for a number of reasons. The presence of multidisciplines, ministers, international organisations, business leaders, etc., were unique at the time. Cross-boundary or cross-arena, or however I'm saying it, really helped to portray ENV as a key player in mapping the problem of environmental change, offering solutions and circulating this knowledge outwards across many spaces and scales, and legitimising new forms of environmental expertise, predominantly through science or technology or techno-scientific forms of management. And this happens, through the reach and the salience of the knowledge that was shared at these seminars. And they were important sites of knowledge circulation, discussion, and imagining of futures at a time when environmental challenges were, still quite unknown, but they were a big concern. But ultimately, it was all contingent on Zuckerman. Zuckerman secured the funding. Zuckerman mainly organised what was to be discussed, and rather than democratically or collectively producing environmental futures, they were guided or trickled down from like the citadel of Zuckerman into the seminar space. And so, of course, there's infinite ways that they could possibly have happened if someone who was not heavily involved in the government attended, or it may have been collectively co-produced by ENV and its researchers. But obviously, this didn't happen. But lastly, there is actually quite little physical evidence of the actual legacy of the seminars, except for the role that those in ENV feel that they played in making ENV as a visible space of authoritative knowledge. There's no direct policy that emerged or came about from the attendance, nor is there any easily traceable citations of the edited proceedings. But I wouldn't discount the implied passive or effective properties that the coming together of an epistemically diverse group of individuals or actors had on the respective futures that were imagined or possible to be imagined, the courses of action, shifting values, and the decisions that were shaped. And so, thank you for listening.